Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's weekly EO Byte. This week one of our engineers, Alex, is going to go over bandwidth control with you guys. We hope you enjoy the video, and we will see you guys next week.
Hi everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at Zscaler's bandwidth control feature. We're going to talk about what it is at a high level, some of the technical configuration, as well as best practices to optimize your network performance. So what is bandwidth control? It's a component of Zscaler Internet Access that enables organizations to manage and prioritize internet traffic effectively. So by setting policies that define bandwidth limits and priorities for specific applications or URL categories, businesses can ensure that critical applications receive the necessary resources while less essential traffic is appropriately managed. Let's take a look at where these bandwidth control policies are defined. If you go to Policy under Access Control and click Bandwidth Control, you'll see a number of pre-populated bandwidth control rules. The defaults are going to be streaming media bandwidth, large file bandwidth, and the default bandwidth control rule. By default, both the streaming bandwidth and the default rule are not actually going to have any effect, as their bandwidth limits are going to be set to 0 to 100%, allowing the full range of bandwidth for any of those destination URLs or cloud apps. The large file bandwidth does have a default limit of 10% to 100%, meaning you're guaranteeing a minimum bandwidth of 10% of the available total for any large files. We'll talk about what constitutes a large file in a moment here. In order to properly leverage bandwidth control, you do need to first build out locations within Zscaler. In order to do that, we go to Administration, and under Resources and Traffic Forwarding, you'll go to Location Management. If this looks unfamiliar, that's okay. We'll walk through what locations are at a very high level here. Essentially, locations are going to map your organization's egress IPs to any of their LAN subnetting behind those egress IPs, giving you more granularity in logging and the ability to granularly define security policy based on those parent locations or sublocations. The parent location is always going to contain the egress IP associated with that location, while the sublocations are going to contain the LAN addressing. In my case, based out of Boston here, we do actually have a branch connector location already configured with a couple sublocations. So we can use these as examples as we build out bandwidth control policies. You do need to manually enable bandwidth control for each location and or sublocation. In this case, we're going to do an example for the entire parent location of Boston. So I'm going to click the pencil icon here. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the bandwidth control section. When we click this to enabled, you'll see it asks you to input the download and upload limits. Zscaler does recommend that you take 10 to 15% off of the total available upload and download speeds, as these are typically reserved for TCP traffic overhead and are not included in Zscaler's bandwidth calculations. In my case, I typically have 300 megabits per second available up and down, so I'm going to use a value of 270 for both. Now that we have a location defined, let's take a look back under Policy, Access Control, Bandwidth Control again, and let's see what we have available to us. For the large file bandwidth, if I click the pencil icon, you'll see the following criteria available. We've already set the bandwidth class to large files. There are others available by default, and we'll talk about how to add custom bandwidth classes too. For now, let's keep it set to large files and take a look at locations. Here you can see the full list of locations that we saw earlier in the location management configuration menu. And if we scroll down, we'll see all of the sublocations available for Boston as well. In my case, since I enabled bandwidth control for the parent location, it is going to be available for all of my sublocations as well. So let's choose all of our available sublocations and associate it to this policy. You'll also see we have location groups available. So if you've created your own location groups or you want to use Zscaler's default designations for corporate user versus server traffic, you can also specify those here. You also have a time criteria available, which will let you specify when these controls are enforced. You can do it on specific days of the week and specific times of day. This is useful if you only want to maintain bandwidth controls during peak business hours or during the workday and allow your users to get full bandwidth when taking their device home, for example. You also have the protocols field available if you want to be specific about which protocols to apply the bandwidth controls to. In this case, we're going to keep it set to any. The most important field is the action field, where you're going to set your minimum and maximum bandwidth. For your minimum, you have anything between 0 and 100% available. And for your maximum, you'll have anything between 5 and 100% available. In this case, we saw that by default, large file bandwidth guarantees a minimum of 10% of your available bandwidth for these large file uploads. Let's turn this up to 50%. Now you may be wondering, what constitutes a large file, or how do you create new bandwidth classes? We can do this by going under Administration, Access Control, and Bandwidth Classes. Here you'll see there are tabs at the top. Let's start with large files. This is a simple drop-down where you specify the minimum file size required to constitute a large file and apply the bandwidth control policy that we created earlier. Let's turn this to 100. If you go to web conferencing applications, you can specify which specific apps will apply to the web conferencing bandwidth class. This is going to be WebEx, GoToMeeting, Live Meeting, Agency Revolution, or Intercall at this time. And if we go to VoIP applications, there is a separate VoIP bandwidth class, which contains just Skype today. Now, if we go back to the Cloud Applications tab, you'll see the default bandwidth classes that are available in every ZIA tenant. You can actually modify these apart from general surfing. If we go into File Share, you'll see that there are 2 domains added by default. You can actually add your own in addition to these. Or if you'd prefer to create your own bandwidth class, you can click Add Bandwidth Class, specify a name, and associate either Zscaler default or custom URL categories, as well as cloud applications. In addition, you could specify the domains separately here. Now let's talk through a use case for limiting maximum available bandwidth for a productivity loss application. In this case, let's set a limit for YouTube and Twitch. For the sake of example, I'm going to create a new bandwidth class that contains just these 2, and I'll add them as cloud applications. After selecting the 2 cloud apps and naming the bandwidth class, I'm going to go ahead and save. Now if I go back to Policy, Access Control, and then Bandwidth Control, I can create a new bandwidth control rule. We'll put it at the top. We're going to call this Limit YouTube and Twitch. And here, I'm going to select our new bandwidth control class that we just created, YouTube and Twitch. And I'm actually going to apply this just to my Boston sublocations. I'm also going to specify a time and say we're only going to apply this on weekdays from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and call this the work week. Here, I'll keep the minimum bandwidth set to 0, but we are going to cap the maximum bandwidth to 15%. This isn't going to block YouTube or Twitch outright, but it is going to guarantee that any of my users connecting out of Boston are going to be prioritizing traffic for business essential applications or URLs outside of things like YouTube and Twitch. Lastly, we highly recommend using some of the default interactive reports to monitor the bandwidth across various criteria. If we go ahead and search bandwidth within interactive reports, you'll see that there are a number of pre-populated ones. Top users, top departments, top locations by bandwidth use and loss, as well as overall bandwidth loss trends, URL categories, and locations consuming bandwidth. In my opinion, it's often useful to look at top departments by bandwidth loss. You'll be able to tell if you have your Entra ID or other IDP department attribute synced, which ones are experiencing the most bandwidth loss across which bandwidth classes, and this will help you tailor your future policy. If you want to dive deeper into a particular department, you can just click here, then click View Logs, and it'll take you directly into the Web Insights, where you can see specific destinations that are being tagged as this bandwidth loss URL class. I hope this helps shed some light on Zscaler's bandwidth control capabilities. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.